Good afternoon, Thami, and again, good afternoon to the viewers. Let us start with the fact that in the last two quarters, that is quarter 2 and quarter 3 of 2020, we had seen that there were movements between the not economically active to economically active, and we need to unpack that a bit. Because of COVID-19 lockdown, many people were seated at home and not actively looking for employment. And indeed, when the lockdown conditions were being eased off, they moved out of that category. Now, what we have seen is that we have seen about 890 people moving out of the not economically active. Would I say other not economically active, because the discouraged work seeker is also part of the not economically active, to start actively looking for employment or to take up employment. So we have seen an increase in those that are employed by 333,000 jobs. And those that are unemployed moved from 6.5 million people to 7.2 million people, an increase by about 701,000 people. And that accounts for the unemployment rate of 32.5% as we stand during the fourth quarter of 2020.
Was this to be expected, considering the dynamics of the COVID-19 pandemic and the impact thereof? Are these numbers a surprise?
As statisticians in official practice, we never get surprised, Thami, by any number. Having said so, the movements of people in terms of being employed, unemployed, or discouraged work seeker cannot be predicted under any circumstances, because as lockdown conditions are being eased, they tend to move either way. They can move straight to being employed if there are more jobs to take up, or they can move to the unemployment category. But one thing that we are seeing is that unlike in the second quarter of 2020, where our unemployment rate had dropped to 23.3%, and that was caused by the fact that there were no people actively looking for employment as we were at alert level stage 5 as a country. Now, what we are seeing now, as we have seen in the third quarter, is a steady rise of unemployment. We will remember that in the third quarter of 2020, unemployment was sitting at 30.8%, and now it has increased by 1.7 percentage points to 32.5%, which of course remains the highest in the country, in the country's history of unemployment.
If you could, Mr. Maluleke, put this into perspective for us in terms of the expanded definition of unemployment. What is it looking like with that in mind?
Firstly, let us look at the narrow definition which defines our official unemployment rate. That is the 7.2 million persons who were actively looking for employment in the fourth quarter of 2020. When we add to that the 2.9 million people who are your discouraged work seeker, then we also include the 1 million people who didn't look for employment for other reasons. But if employment had been available, they would have taken it. We come to 11.1 million people. Those 11.1 million people account for 42.6%, which is our expanded unemployment rate. So what we can see is that there are about 10.1 percentage points difference between the official unemployment rate of 32.5% and the expanded unemployment rate of 42.6%.
Mr. Maluleke, I'm here with our business editor, Xolani Mbanjwa. Xolani, if you could just jump in here as well.
Mr. Maluleke, good afternoon. I'm interested in which sectors were actually contributing most to this particular increase in the fourth quarter of this data that we actually received this afternoon.
Xolani, the biggest losses in employment were in finance. The finance sector lost 123,000 jobs. And of course, when we look at the mining sector, it lost 33,000 jobs. So those were the biggest losses. Whereas there were gains in community and social services of about 170,000 jobs. There were also gains in construction of about 76,000 jobs. And indeed, there were gains in private households, but they were not enough to offset the unemployment rate from rising.
What about those who are not in employment, education or training, since these are the highest unemployment numbers that we have received now since the start of the compilation of the QLFS in 2008?
Let us look at young people aged 15 to 24 years. And those are the ones that we expect to be either at school or employed. Now, those of that age cohort in our country, they are about 10.3 million. And out of the 10.3 million, 3.1 million of those are not in employment, education, and training. And this 3.1 million accounts for 31%. But when you look at those aged 15 to 34 years, and youth formations tend to want to know about this age cohort, we can see that for those, about 41% are not in employment, education, or training. But it's not young people who are vulnerable to labor markets alone, Xolani. What we see is that women in general are vulnerable to labor markets, but particularly Black African women, because the unemployment rate of Black African women is sitting at 38.5%, which is a jump of 6 percentage points from the national average of 32.5%.
And when we look at the working age population, they increased also by 143,000 people in the fourth quarter alone. This should actually tell us that more and more people are actually eligible to work but cannot find work. Is there something that you have found which points to the fact that the fourth quarter may be the most difficult quarter after the second quarter that we experienced in 2020?
Xolani, for a statistician like myself in official practice, there are no difficult situations. We all report what we find out there. One thing that we see from around 2010 is that the labor force participation rate has been rising steadily, coming out from around 2010. When we compare it with the absorption rate, and let's start with explaining the labor force participation rate, is the proportion of the working age people who are either employed or unemployed. Then when we look at the absorption rate, which is the proportion of the working age people who are employed, when we look at the gap in around 2010, the gap was about 13 percentage points. Where we are sitting now, it's about 18.1 percentage points. And it tells us that there are more and more people who are of working age, but who then are not absorbed sufficiently enough in the labor markets.
Talk to us, Mr. Maluleke, about the number of people who are not economically active for reasons other than discouragement. Talk to us about the numbers there.
Let us look at the number of people who are not economically active. Let us say that the discouraged work seeker is part of the people that are not economically active. But when we remove the discouraged work seeker, we remain with what we call other not economically active. And that category includes students, people who are old or young, too old or too young to work according to them, people who are ill to be able to take up employment, as well as people who for any other reason would not take up employment. And that category also includes homemakers. Now, when we look at the people who had other reasons, and I want us to look historically from Q2. In Q2, we had about 20.6 million people who were in the category of other not economically active. That decreased in Q3 of 2020 to about 18.1 million. And when we look at that now, it has decreased to about 17 million. So what is happening is that because of the COVID-19 lockdown restrictions coming out of alert level stage 5 all the way to 3, we can see that when restrictions are being eased off for people to be able to move about, they then are decreasing from what we have seen of about 20.6 million down to about 17 million of other generally not economically active. But when we look at the other not economically active, then we are sitting at about 15 million, which says that people are moving out. And as they move out, they move into the state of taking up employment, or they are unemployed, or they can be the discouraged work seeker.
And Mr. Maluleke, I just want to put you on the spot on this one. We have been using, along with many other countries, the narrow definition of unemployment, and that is actually quickly catching up with the expanded definition of unemployment, which has decreased 0.5% to 42.6%, which is something good. Isn't it time, you think, that we adopt the expanded definition of unemployment to include all those who are actually who have actually given up looking for employment?
Xolani, you can never put me on the spot, nor any other statistician in official practice can ever feel the pressure of any question asked to them. The first thing that we need to look at is, as statisticians, we do not define what gets measured. We only deal with the how. We define the methods of what gets measured. And in this regard, when you look, for example, at the issue of the working age people in South Africa from 15 years to 64 years, it's what the law says. The law says you cannot employ anybody of an age lower than 15 years, and people beyond 64 years should not be working. And indeed, on the official definition, which is our narrow definition, it's not defined by us as statisticians. The National Development Plan says we will track as a country the unemployment rate as a narrow definition, and our job is to go and measure. So when this decision is taken otherwise by policymakers as the what, we will go and deal with the how to measure. And in this regard, Xolani, I can measure anything. That's why we make both numbers available. If the country adopts any other option, we will go along with that and measure that. But we always make the numbers available for the public to know.
Well, thank you so much for your time this afternoon, Mr. Maluleke. Much appreciated. That's the Statistician-General, Mr. Risenga Maluleke, there on the latest numbers that have just been released as far as unemployment is concerned.